I'm Susan Koenig, and this is Somatics for You. Today we're going to be a little bit more anatomical. Usually in these videos I show a specific movement. Today I'm going to show about differentiated movement at certain joints, the hip joints, the pelvis. The pelvis is actually divided into two parts. I'll come back to that. The reason that we're doing this is because when you have a better idea and awareness of where the joints are that you're moving, your internalization of the movement becomes more competent, and then the movements that involve the hip, the pelvis, even the knee and foot, ankle, and low back become more competent. So, when I move the thigh bone, which is the femur, when I move that in the hip socket is in the pelvis. Here I'm moving the hip joint in the pelvis. Now, this whole thing is the pelvis. The pelvis has some joints. Between the two pubic bones, there's a joint. And in the back, each hemipelvis is attached to the sacrum at the sacroiliac joint. This is the ilium bone, the sacrum, so we have a sacroiliac joint and a sacroiliac joint. So each half pelvis or hemipelvis also has the ability to move between the pubic bone and the sacroiliac, so that, for example, when we walk, each hemipelvis is also moving in a small movement in opposition to each other. So we're going to look at how to apply the differentiation of hip movement and hemipelvis movement and whole pelvic movement today, so that we can become more efficient when we are doing movements that involve the hips, that involve the pelvis, and involve the lower back. So I'm going to lie down on the floor now. And I'm going to bend my left leg because I think it'll be easier for you to see. And I'm going to put my hands right on top of the hip point, the ilium bones in the front. In fact, I'll just do this hand. And I'm going to very slowly and in a small movement with my foot on the floor, I'm going to move in my hip joint. My femur bone is moving in my hip joint. I know I'm not in my pelvis because with my hands on the front of my ilium bones, if I'm in my pelvis, I'll feel my hands move as my pelvis moves. So if my pelvis remains stable on the floor, if my buttocks in the back remain flat on the floor, I know that I'm in my hip joint and I'm differentiating hip joint movement from pelvic movement. Now, I can take my hip joint movement out far enough that at a certain point I can start feeling the participation of my left and now my right hemipelvis, and now I'm moving both from my hip joint, joining the left hemipelvis, and now the right hemipelvis is also joining in, so that I can feel the differentiation of those movements. That can really help a person understand where they are in the movement, and that differentiation is then internalized in our awareness, and it's very helpful. I can bend both legs now, and now I'm going to imitate in the pelvis the walking movement. Not so much, I'm not swinging my legs, I'm not standing up, but what's happening in the pelvis. So in the pelvis, one leg comes forward, that hemipelvis comes forward a little bit, the other hemipelvis goes back. Now, even though I've got some hip joint movement, I'm really generating the movement from my pelvis, and I'm creating an oppositional, more independent movement of each hemipelvis. I can also just, let me put this right leg down, I can also just lift and bend my left leg, and very gently I can move again, focusing on my hip joint. I know I'm in my hip joint because I can feel my pelvis nice and stable and not moving against the floor. My buttocks are against the floor. And again, I can be in my hip joint. If I take this flexion movement further, then I can feel my left hemipelvis begin to participate, and that joint between the pubic bone and the sacroiliac joint is now moving with my hip joint is moving first, then my left hemipelvis is joining in. If I go very far in my flexibility, I have to raise my other hip and hemipelvis. So it's nice to start doing these slow movements and becoming aware of, am I in my hip? Am I in a hemipelvis? Am I in a whole pelvic movement? If I do something like this, now I'm more conscious of moving my pelvis as a unit. My hips are sort of participating, but I'm really generating that movement through the low back, through the whole somatic center, and through my pelvic bones. I hope that this little anatomy lesson on differentiating movement in between hip, hemipelvis, and pelvis helps you start to internalize and understand and bring more awareness to your movements. And when you bring more internal awareness to your movements, you move better and you don't create so many contracted muscles in the first place. Thank you very much.